Awake, Godsmack's sophomore album, and ultimately a continuation of the success they established on the self-titled record. Awake's a pretty interesting record because it's also their second most successful record, after the first one of course, and it basically breaks the sophomore slump for Godsmack. It proves these guys have more to offer than what you'd assume based off similar bands who came out of the gate swinging. This is also the band's first album with a full-time drummer, with Tommy Stewart taking the place of the drum kit after Sully Erna. And that highlights a very reoccurring positive trait in Godsmack's career. For the most part, across all of these albums, the drumming is pretty freaking sweet. These guys play very well, and that's something I can't stress enough, is these guys are genuinely talented as musicians. Considering every record after Awake is going to feature Shannon Larkin, I imagine I'm going to be repeating the drumming compliment very soon. That aside, I would say Awake is an even less interesting album than Self-Titled. Now, the band does branch out slightly more on this album. They do expand their horizons a little bit. And I would ultimately say Awake is the catalyst for what would later become Godsmack sounds on subsequent records. But even so, it's just not very good. And it also highlights what's going to be a recurring detriment to Godsmack's career on every subsequent record. And that's repetitiveness, because there's many times on this album where I felt as though I was listening to one long song as opposed to a cohesive album that tells a story. I will give credit where it's due. There is good music on this album. Sick of Life is a great opener. It's just Godsmack sledgehammering their way through the door. The title track is very good. It still holds up really well compared to how a lot of other bands from this era, just their singles are laughable now, or they've aged terribly. For the most part, I would say it's still a very interesting song, and it's one of the better songs in Godsmack's career. Vampires takes the concept established on Someone in London and expands it into a full song, so I made note of that. Considering 2 songs on this album were reworked B-sides from Self-Titled, it only makes me wish that Someone in London was used as the introduction for Vampires, instead of being wasted as an intro to Get Up, Get Out. Even if Someone in London was indirectly a more necessary track to Self-Titled, artistically speaking, I just think it would be better off here. So we've got Sick of Life and Awake, and a semi-interesting song with Vampires. I mean, Spiral's a good song. Much like Voodoo, it shows off how Sully Erna's Wiccan theology is seeping into his music and influencing his art. But I can't get over how much it sounds like a reworked version of Greed. Even though it does have some traits that separate it from Greed, such as the Middle Eastern rhythm and female vocals, ultimately it's so derivative that I can barely even acknowledge how unique those traits are, because all it's doing is making me think of an earlier song on the album. Greed was a fine track. I mean, it was good enough for me to make a mental note of it, but even so, it's not really that interesting. It's just pretty standard alternative metal. And this pretty much goes back to what I said earlier when I was complaining about the first record, is there's a lot of interesting ideas Godsmack has, but generally speaking, they fail to make that leap forward. Why they do that, I'm not so sure. I don't know if that's label pressure, or if they're writing to specifically cater to a general sound on radio, or if they're just afraid of branching out. Trippin' is another example of a song that could be great, but ultimately isn't. It has this very sinister melody that's really, really cool. It's probably one of the better Godsmack songs. If I could compare it to anything, I would compare it to Castaway by Jerry Cantrell, which is interesting because Trippin' came out 2 years before Castaway. So to some degree, it's almost like Godsmack influencing Jerry as opposed to the other way around. However, ultimately, Trippin' also lacks that extra push to make it an interesting song or make it something that I really enjoy or get a lot out of. Bad Magic is the worst song on this album. It features some of Sully Erna's worst vocal melodies, and honestly, it's almost like Godsmack cosplaying as the caricature their critics have painted them as. The bridge is really the worst part of this song. Like, the way Sully is singing here is almost laughable. It's like a parody of his own voice. I have no idea how at no point during the production anybody was like, hey dude, you sound weird as hell here. Why are you doing that? Like, stop that. Or hey, maybe you should rework this. They just kept it in the album. And as I understand it, this was a leftover from the first album, the self-titled one. And really, that's where it should have stayed. There's no reason this song needed to be released on a future album, as it doesn't add anything to their career, it just detracts from it. Going Down, I think, is the second song that was also left off the first album and reworked here. And the drumming on here is very unique. I would say it sounds more like the first record. So much to the point where I don't even think Tommy Stewart is playing on this. I think it's Sully Erna. Awake as a whole record does sound more in line with what I expect from Godsmack, and while they do take a little bit more creative liberties on this record, ultimately outside of Sick of Life and the title track, there's nothing on here that really captures my attention the same way Keep Away, Whatever, and Voodoo did. And while that's really only 3 songs compared to the 2 on Awake, it's really just one more song. I will say those 3 songs alone are more interesting than even the 2 songs I enjoyed off of Awake. While this may not be a sophomore slump in the commercial sense, for me as a listener, I do think this is a step down from what they had on their first album, and ultimately is probably one of the worst experiences I've had playing a record from beginning to end. Outside of the title track, there really isn't much going on this record. It's just not very good. And that's it.